Was it possible to fall in love with someone you never intended to care for at all? Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, each drop racing downward like tears the sky refused to hold back. Inside, a man sat motionless at his mahogany desk, staring at a leather-bound contract that would change everything. The document was simple, clinical even. A marriage agreement, 2 signatures, 1 year, no emotions involved, just business. That's what he told himself as he uncapped the fountain pen his father had given him before he died. That's what he believed when he signed his name in bold, deliberate strokes. Alexander Chen had built an empire from the ashes of his family's failed company, clawing his way back from bankruptcy through pure determination and calculated risks that would have destroyed lesser men. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in soulmates, and he certainly didn't believe in love at first sight. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a distraction from the mission that consumed every waking moment of his 32 years. His company, Chen Technologies, stood on the precipice of either unprecedented success or complete ruin, and the choice wasn't entirely his own. The old guard of the business world, those silver-haired men in their private clubs who still controlled the flow of capital like medieval lords, they had made their position clear. Traditional values, family stability. A married man was a trustworthy man, they said, swirling their scotch in crystal glasses, older than most of the employees in Alexander's company. Without their backing, the venture capital he needed would evaporate like morning fog. Everything he had sacrificed, every relationship he had let wither, every birthday and holiday he had spent alone in his office while the city celebrated below, it would all mean nothing. So he made a decision that felt entirely logical at the time. He would find someone practical, someone who understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. Someone who needed what he could offer, as much as he needed what she could provide. Enter Sophia Williams. She walked into the upscale cafe where they had agreed to meet with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. Alexander noticed her hands first. Delicate but strong, wrapped around a worn leather portfolio that had seen better days, an artist's hands. She was younger than he expected, perhaps 27, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style that suggested she had more important things to think about than fashion trends. Her clothes were clean but dated, the kind of outfit someone wears when they're trying to look professional on a budget that barely covers rent. There was no pretense about her, no performative charm or calculated seduction. She looked tired. When their eyes met across the table, Alexander saw something he recognized instantly. Desperation wrapped in dignity, the look of someone who had fought hard and was still fighting, even as the world pushed back with relentless force. Her story spilled out in measured tones, neither pleading nor cold, just honest in a way that caught him off guard. Her brother Daniel was dying. Leukemia. The treatments that might save him weren't covered by the insurance their family could afford. She had sold everything. Her car, her grandmother's jewelry, even her art supplies, the tools of the only trade she knew. She had worked 3 jobs simultaneously, sleeping 4 hours a night, painting in the stolen moments between shifts. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Medical debt in America didn't negotiate or show mercy. It simply grew, a monster that fed on hope and crushed families under its weight. She needed money, $200,000 to be exact, for experimental treatments at a clinic that didn't accept payment plans. In exchange, she would give him 1 year of her life. She would play the role of devoted wife in public, attend his business functions, smile for the cameras, and provide the veneer of domestic stability that his investors demanded. In private, they would live separate lives in his spacious penthouse. No emotions, no complications, no expectations beyond the contract. Alexander found the arrangement refreshingly straightforward. He transferred the money to the clinic that same week. They were married in a civil ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon, with his lawyer and her younger brother as the only witnesses. Daniel attended in a wheelchair, his once athletic frame diminished by illness, but his smile bright enough to light the sterile courthouse room. Sophia wore a simple cream-colored dress she had borrowed from a friend, and when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander caught something flickering across her face. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps relief. The kind that comes when you've been drowning and someone finally throws you a rope. They didn't kiss. They shook hands like business partners closing a deal, which is exactly what they were. The first month of their arrangement unfolded exactly as planned. Sophia moved into the guest wing of his penthouse, a space she occupied like a polite ghost, present but barely visible. She attended the charity galas and investor dinners he required, transforming somehow into a poised companion who knew exactly when to speak and when to listen. She was good at reading rooms, at making powerful strangers feel heard and important. Alexander began to notice how conversations shifted when she joined them, how tense negotiations became friendlier, how even the most cynical investors seemed to soften in her presence. But it was in the quiet moments, the unplanned encounters in their shared home, that something unexpected began to grow. He would find her on the balcony at dawn, coffee cup warming her hands as she watched the city wake beneath a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. She never seemed to mind when he joined her in silence, two people occupying the same space without the need for words to fill it. He learned that she took her coffee black, that she hummed old jazz standards when she thought no one was listening, that she read poetry books so worn the pages were soft as fabric. One evening, he came home late from a meeting that had gone catastrophically wrong. A deal he had spent months cultivating had collapsed in spectacular fashion, taking with it a significant portion of his projected revenue. He found Sophia in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her forearms as she kneaded bread dough with methodical precision. She looked up when he entered, reading the defeat in his posture instantly. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurance. She simply poured him a glass of wine, returned to her bread, and began talking about something else entirely. A documentary she had watched about deep-sea creatures that survive in absolute darkness, miles below the surface where no light penetrates. Her voice was soothing, her story fascinating. And somewhere in that kitchen filled with the yeast and warmth smell of rising dough, Alexander felt something inside him begin to unknot. It was a small thing, insignificant really, but it lodged itself in his memory like a stone in a shoe, impossible to ignore. They began having breakfast together, not because the contract required it, but because somehow it just started happening. She would be reading at the table when he emerged from his room, and he would pour himself coffee and sit across from her, and they would talk about everything and nothing. She told him about the brother she was saving, about how Daniel had been her protector when their parents died in a car accident during her freshman year of college, how he had worked 2 jobs to keep her in school, how he had been the one to encourage her painting even when it seemed impractical. Alexander found himself talking too, sharing things he had never told anyone, about the shame of watching his father's company crumble, about the hunger that had motivated every decision since, about the loneliness of success that felt hollow without anyone to share it with. 6 weeks into their marriage of convenience, Alexander realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that he was waiting for her, waiting to hear her key in the lock when she came home from visiting her brother. Waiting for her laugh, rare but genuine, that seemed to brighten even the sterile modern spaces of his carefully designed home. Waiting for the sound of her footsteps, for the way she said his name, for the moments when she would absently touch his arm while making a point in conversation. And that's when he understood the terrible mistake he had made. You cannot share your space with someone, cannot witness their grief and strength and quiet courage day after day, cannot see them fighting for someone they love with everything they have, and remain unaffected. The human heart doesn't honor contracts or respect boundaries drawn on paper. It simply does what it was designed to do. It reaches toward warmth and light, like a plant growing toward the sun, whether you want it to or not. Alexander Chen, who had calculated every risk and planned for every contingency, had failed to account for the one variable that could destroy everything. He was falling in love with his wife, and she had no idea. The contract had 4 more months to run, 4 months until she would take her money, having saved her brother's life, and walk out of his forever. 4 months to either hide what he felt or risk breaking the very agreement that had brought her into his life in the first place. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows of the penthouse, and somewhere in another room, Sophia was painting again. Alexander could hear the soft scrape of brush against canvas, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. She had started painting 3 weeks ago, hesitantly at first, as if she had forgotten she had the right to create something beautiful while her brother fought for his life in sterile hospital rooms. Alexander had quietly converted one of the unused rooms into a studio for her, installing north-facing windows and proper lighting, leaving supplies on the empty easel without a word. He never told her it was for her. He simply left the door open one morning and watched from a distance as she discovered it, her hand rising to cover her mouth, eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Now, he stood outside that room, his hand raised to knock, then falling again. What would he say? How do you tell someone that the boundaries you both agreed to have become unbearable? That every morning across the breakfast table feels like torture and salvation intertwined? That the professional distance between them has become the most intimate space he has ever inhabited? His phone buzzed, shattering the moment. A text from his lawyer. The investors were pleased. The Thornton Group had signed the papers that morning, 20 million in venture capital secured. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was finally coming together. His company would not only survive, it would thrive. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt empty, because he knew now what he had traded to get here, and the price was starting to feel unbearable. The sound of painting stopped. The door opened before he could step away, and there was Sophia, paint smudged on her cheek, wearing an old shirt that hung loose on her frame. Her eyes were red. Not from tears, but from the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep. Something was wrong. He knew it instantly, the way you know when a storm is coming by the change in air pressure. She tried to smile, but it cracked at the edges. Daniel's latest test results had come back. The treatment was working, but slower than hoped. They needed more time, which meant more money, which meant extending treatments the insurance still wouldn't cover. Another $100,000. Maybe more. The experimental protocol was their last hope. But hope came with a price tag that multiplied like cells dividing, endless and hungry. Alexander watched her struggle to form the words, to ask for more when she had already asked for so much. Pride and desperation warred in her expression, and he wanted to tell her that she never had to ask, that he would give her anything. That money meant nothing compared to the way she had changed the texture of his life simply by existing in it. Instead, he said what he thought she needed to hear. That it wasn't a problem, that he would transfer the funds immediately, that the contract would be extended if she needed more time. Practical, businesslike, exactly what they had agreed to be. The relief in her eyes should have satisfied him, but it didn't. Because underneath it, he saw something else, a kind of resignation, as if she was tallying up debts she could never repay, adding weights to chains she already carried. She thanked him with quiet dignity, then retreated back into her studio, the door closing with a soft click that felt like a wall being built, brick by brick, between what was and what could never be. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He stood in his office, the city sprawling below him like a circuit board of light and darkness, and he made a decision that terrified him. He would tell her. Not now. Not when she was drowning in worry about Daniel, but soon, when the time was right, when she had space to breathe and think and choose freely. He would tell her that the contract meant nothing to him anymore, that she could stay or go, that the money was hers regardless, that what he felt was real even if it broke every rule they had set. The weeks that followed felt like living in a photograph that was slowly developing, details emerging from blur into painful clarity. Alexander found himself noticing everything about her. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. The small scar on her wrist from a childhood bicycle accident. How she always gave money to street musicians, even when she was counting pennies. The particular shade of sadness in her eyes when she returned from hospital visits, carrying Daniel's courage like something precious and fragile. They fell into rhythms that felt dangerously domestic. She would read on the couch while he worked at the dining table, both comfortable in shared silence. They started cooking together on weekends, an activity neither had planned but both seemed to need. The simple alchemy of chopping vegetables and timing dishes, working in synchronized movements that required no discussion. She taught him that cooking was improvisation, that recipes were suggestions, not laws. He taught her that some things required precision, that patience was a skill you could develop like any other. One Saturday, while making pasta from scratch, flour dusting every surface, and their hands working the dough in parallel, she laughed, really laughed, for the first time since he had known her. The sound was startling and beautiful, like finding unexpected color in a monochrome world. He looked up and found her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something soft and surprised and maybe frightened, before she quickly looked away and focused intently on rolling the pasta dough into thin, perfect sheets. In that moment, Alexander wondered if perhaps he wasn't alone in this. If perhaps the walls she had built so carefully were showing cracks, letting light through from the other side. But he couldn't be sure, and the risk of being wrong felt catastrophic. If he spoke too soon, if he shattered the delicate equilibrium they had achieved, he might lose even the friendship that had grown in the spaces between their agreement. So he stayed silent, and the question hung in the air between them like humidity before a storm. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in early autumn, when the air had just begun to carry the first whisper of cold, and the city lights seemed sharper against the darkening sky. Alexander came home to find Sophia sitting in the dark living room, no lights on, just the glow from the windows casting her in silhouette. He knew immediately. The quality of her stillness told him everything before she spoke. Daniel had taken a turn. Not for the worse, but not for the better either. He was stable but not improving, caught in a liminal space between recovery and relapse. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, which Sophia had learned was medical speak for, "We don't know, and we're afraid to give you hope." She was so tired. Not just physically, though the exhaustion was written in every line of her body. Soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying weight for so long, you forget what it feels like to stand up straight. Alexander sat beside her, not too close, respecting the distance she seemed to need. And then she began to talk. Really talk, in a way she hadn't before. About the guilt of continuing to live her life while Daniel fought for his. About the weight of being someone's only family, their only advocate, their only reason to keep fighting. About the fear that maybe she had made the wrong choices, that maybe there had been a better path she couldn't see. About how painting felt like betrayal sometimes, like she was choosing beauty and creation, while death circled her brother's hospital bed like a patient predator. Her voice cracked, and then the tears came, silent at first, then building into sobs that shook her entire frame. Without thinking, Alexander pulled her into his arms. She resisted for half a heartbeat, then collapsed into him, her face buried in his chest. Years of contained grief finally finding release. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, the other firm against her back, trying to communicate through touch what he couldn't say in words. that she wasn't alone, that her strength amazed him, that she was allowed to break sometimes, that he would hold the pieces until she was ready to put herself back together. When the storm finally subsided, she didn't pull away immediately. She stayed there, breathing against him, and in that moment, everything changed. The air between them became charged with something neither could ignore anymore. She lifted her head slowly, and their faces were inches apart. He could see his reflection in her eyes, could feel her breath against his skin. The moment stretched, suspended in amber, both of them balanced on the edge of a decision that would alter everything. And then his phone rang. The sound was jarring, violent in the quiet intimacy they had created. Alexander pulled it from his pocket, ready to silence it, but the caller ID made him freeze. The hospital. Sophia saw it too. The color drained from her face as he answered, putting it on speaker so she could hear. The voice on the other end was clinical but kind, a nurse they had both come to know through months of visits. Daniel had requested to see them both. Tonight. It was important, she said, though she wouldn't elaborate. Something in her tone suggested urgency, but not emergency, a distinction that mattered in the arithmetic of illness. They drove to the hospital in Alexander's car, the city lights blurring past like memories streaming backward. Sophia's hand rested on the center console, and without thinking, Alexander covered it with his own. She didn't pull away. She laced her fingers through his and held on tight, and neither of them spoke about what it meant. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always smell, antiseptic attempting to mask something deeper and more troubling. They found Daniel in his private room, the one Alexander's money had secured. He looked better than the last time they had visited, still thin, still marked by illness, but with color in his cheeks and clarity in his eyes that had been absent for weeks. He smiled when they entered, and Sophia rushed to his side, taking his hand. Daniel's gaze moved between his sister and Alexander, seeing something that made his smile deepen. He had always been perceptive, Sophia had said. Even as children, he could read people the way she read colors and light. What he saw now seemed to satisfy something in him. He spoke carefully, his voice still weak but determined. He had been thinking, he said, about time and chances and the things we tell ourselves matter, about how illness has a way of clarifying what's real and what's just noise. He looked at his sister with profound love and said something that would change everything. He told her he didn't want her to keep sacrificing, that watching her give up everything for him was harder than the illness itself. That he had seen what was happening between her and Alexander, even if they hadn't fully admitted it to themselves. That life was too short and too uncertain to waste time on fear or guilt or obligations that had transformed into something else entirely. He told her she was allowed to be happy, that she had his blessing to stop fighting alone, to let someone else carry some of the weight. That love, real love, was rarer than they wanted to believe, and walking away from it out of some misplaced sense of duty to a contract would be the real tragedy. Sophia's tears returned, but different this time, softer, mixed with something that might have been relief or permission or the beginning of hope. Daniel's eyes moved to Alexander, and there was a question in them, a challenge. Alexander met that gaze and saw a man who understood exactly what was being asked. Could he be trusted with this? Could he be the person Sophia needed, not just now in crisis, but in all the ordinary moments that would follow? Alexander thought about the contract sitting in his desk drawer, about the clean business transaction they had agreed to, about how completely and irrevocably he had failed to honor its fundamental premise of emotional distance. He thought about breakfast conversations and shared silences and the way she had changed him without trying, just by being exactly who she was. And then, with Daniel watching and Sophia still holding her brother's hand, while also somehow holding his, Alexander did something he had never done in any business negotiation. He told the complete, unvarnished truth. He told them that the contract had stopped mattering months ago. That somewhere between the charity galas and the quiet breakfasts, between watching her fight for her brother and witnessing her paint beauty back into a world that had tried to take everything from her, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love. That he woke up thinking about her and fell asleep with her name on his lips. That the success he had chased so desperately felt meaningless if he couldn't share it with her. That she had become the center of gravity around which his entire world now revolved, and he didn't know how to go back to the man he had been before her, didn't even want to try. The words spilled out raw and unpolished, nothing like the carefully constructed presentations he delivered in boardrooms. This wasn't negotiation. This was surrender. Sophia's eyes were wide, her hand trembling in his. For a terrible moment she said nothing, and Alexander felt the foundations of his world beginning to crack. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, and what she said wasn't what he expected. She was afraid, not of him or his feelings, but of her own. She told them both that she had spent so long in survival mode, so many years being the strong one, the responsible one, the one who held everything together, that she didn't know how to be anything else. That she had felt something growing between them, but had convinced herself it was gratitude or proximity, or the strange intimacy that comes from sharing space during a crisis. That she had told herself 100 times that it couldn't be real, that people don't fall in love in circumstances like theirs, that it was just her exhausted heart mistaking kindness for something deeper. But the truth, which terrified her more than anything, was that she had started counting the days until the contract ended with a sense of dread rather than relief. That coming home to their penthouse had started feeling less like an obligation and more like the only place she wanted to be. That watching him work at the dining table, his brow furrowed in concentration, had become her favorite kind of peace. That somewhere in the last 4 months, Alexander Chen had stopped being her business arrangement and had become the first thought in her morning and the last whisper in her prayers. Daniel listened to them both, and despite his illness, despite the tubes and monitors that tethered him to machines measuring every heartbeat, he laughed, a sound like light breaking through clouds. He told them they were both idiots, but idiots in love, which was the best kind. Then, with the bluntness that only someone who has stared at mortality can muster, he asked them what they were waiting for. Permission? They had it. Perfect timing? It didn't exist. A guarantee that everything would work out? Life offered no such thing. The only question that mattered was whether they wanted to try. Whether the fear of losing each other was greater than the fear of taking the leap. Alexander looked at Sophia, and Sophia looked at Alexander, and in that sterile hospital room with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the steady beep of monitors marking time, they made a choice. Not a contract this time. Something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more real. They would try. They would take the scaffolding of their arrangement and see if something genuine could grow in its place. They would risk the comfortable friendship they had built for the possibility of something more. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was already happening whether they acknowledged it or not. They left the hospital different than they had arrived. Sophia's hand remained in Alexander's as they walked through corridors that seemed less oppressive now, as if the building itself had relaxed its grip. In the car, the silence was different too. Charged but not uncomfortable, full of anticipation rather than avoidance. When they reached the penthouse, Alexander didn't retreat to his wing, and Sophia didn't disappear into hers. Instead, they stood in the living room, suddenly awkward like teenagers, both unsure how to navigate this new territory. Everything had changed and nothing had changed. The space looked the same. The furniture still occupied its careful positions, the city still glittered beyond the windows, but the air between them felt different, heavier with possibility, and lighter with truth finally spoken. Sophia moved to the balcony, and Alexander followed. They stood side by side, watching the city breathe below them, millions of lives playing out in windows and streets, each one a story as complex as their own. She spoke first, her voice carrying on the autumn wind. She wanted to do this right, she said, not rush or force or try to make up for lost time. She wanted to actually date him properly, like normal people who hadn't met through contracts and desperation. She wanted to learn him slowly, deliberately, to build something with intention rather than accident. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, relief mixed with respect. She was right. What they had was valuable enough to deserve care, to be nurtured rather than seized. So they made another agreement, but this one was written in conversation rather than legalese, sealed with smiles rather than signatures. They would take it slow. They would go on actual dates. They would talk about the things people talk about when getting to know each other. Childhood memories and favorite books and the small philosophies that guide how we move through the world. They would give themselves permission to be uncertain, to stumble, to not have all the answers immediately. And they would be honest, painfully so, about what they felt and feared and wanted. That night, Sophia didn't retreat to the guest wing. She fell asleep on the couch, her head on Alexander's shoulder while they watched the city lights slowly dim as dawn approached. He didn't move, didn't want to disturb the perfect weight of her against him, the rise and fall of her breathing synchronized with his own. When morning came, filtering through the windows in shades of gold and pink, she woke slowly and looked up at him. For a moment, confusion crossed her face, then memory, then something that looked remarkably like joy. She smiled, and it was different from all her previous smiles. Unguarded, full, radiant. It was the smile of someone who had decided to stop protecting herself from hope. Their first official date happened 3 days later. Alexander had wanted to do something grand, a helicopter tour of the city, dinner at the most exclusive restaurant, something worthy of the romances he had read about in novels he would never admit to reading. But Sophia had other ideas. She took him to a small art museum in a neighborhood he had never visited, despite living in the city for years. It was the kind of place that survived on grants and donations, where admission was suggested rather than required, where local artists displayed work that would never hang in the major galleries downtown. She moved through the rooms like someone coming home, explaining techniques and color theory, telling him the stories she imagined behind each piece. He watched her more than the art, fascinated by the way she came alive in this space, how her hands moved as she spoke, painting pictures in the air. They had coffee afterward at a corner cafe where the tables wobbled and the mugs were mismatched and everything cost less than the wine he usually drank at business dinners. She asked him questions no one had ever asked, not about his company or his plans or his achievements, but about the moments that had shaped him, about what he had wanted to be as a child before pragmatism took over, about the last time he had created something just for the joy of creating it, about what scared him most, not in business, but in life. He found himself telling her things he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed, about how his father's failure had made him feel like love and loyalty were weaknesses, that caring too much about anything made you vulnerable to loss. About the night he had stood on a bridge during his darkest period after the company collapsed, not planning to jump, but understanding for the first time why people did. About how success had felt hollow, because he had no one to share it with, how every achievement was just another brick in a wall he had built to keep the world out. She listened without judgment, without trying to fix or advise, just bearing witness to his truth the way he had borne witness to hers that night. She cried in his arms. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand, and the gesture was so simple and so profound that he felt something crack open inside him. Not breaking, but opening, like a door long locked, finally remembering how to swing free. She told him that strength wasn't about never falling apart. It was about letting yourself fall apart with someone who would help you put the pieces back together. That vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was the only real bridge between human beings. That he had been brave in all the wrong ways for all the right reasons, and maybe now he could learn a different kind of courage. They dated through October and into November, and it was strange and wonderful and occasionally frustrating in ways that felt entirely normal. They had their first argument about something absurdly trivial, whether to watch a documentary or a comedy, and both of them froze, unsure how to fight with someone who mattered. They learned that disagreement didn't equal disaster, that they could be angry and still care, that resolution was possible when both people valued the relationship more than being right. They had moments of uncertainty when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when Alexander retreated into work and Sophia withdrew into worried silence about Daniel. But they also had moments of startling clarity, when everything felt easy and right, when being together was the simplest thing in the world. Daniel's condition gradually improved. The treatment was working, slowly but steadily, and the doctors started using different words: remission, recovery, hope, without the qualifier of cautious. Sophia began to breathe differently, as if she had been holding her breath for years and was finally remembering how to exhale fully. She painted more, and her work changed. Where before her canvases had been beautiful but melancholic, full of muted tones and solitary figures, now color began to flood back in. Vibrant reds and deep blues and golds that seemed to generate their own light. Alexander bought 3 of her paintings, not because she was his wife, but because they moved him in ways he couldn't articulate, because they captured something essential about beauty emerging from darkness. Then, on a cold Tuesday in late November, something happened that shifted everything again. Alexander received a call from James Thornton, the lead investor whose approval had been so crucial to his company's survival. Thornton wanted to meet for lunch, alone, and there was something in his tone that made Alexander's instincts prickle with warning. They met at Thornton's club, one of those bastions of old money where the leather chairs were older than most members and the portraits on the walls were of men who had shaped industries and economies. Thornton was cordial but serious, swirling his scotch in a way that reminded Alexander of the first time they had met, when marriage had been presented as a condition of investment. What Thornton said made Alexander's blood run cold. He had heard things, rumors, whispers in the circles where such things were whispered, about Alexander's marriage, about how it had happened very suddenly, very conveniently, right before the investment deal was finalized, about the contract that might exist, the arrangement that might not be entirely what it appeared. Thornton wasn't accusing exactly, he was informing, letting Alexander know that questions were being asked, that others among the investor group were having concerns about whether they had been deceived. And if they discovered that the marriage was indeed contractual, if it came out that Alexander had essentially staged a marriage to secure their investment, the consequences would be severe. Not just loss of funding, but potential legal action for fraud, destruction of his reputation, the end of everything he had built. The worst part was that Thornton wasn't threatening him. The old man seemed almost sympathetic. He had grown fond of Sophia during the various social events, had seen something genuine in how she and Alexander interacted. He hoped, he said carefully, that whatever had started as strategy had become something real. Because if it had, then there was no deception. If the marriage was genuine now, regardless of how it began, then the investors had nothing to complain about. But if it was still just an arrangement, if Alexander and Sophia were still just playing roles, then he needed to know immediately so damage control could begin. Alexander drove home in a daze, Thornton's words echoing in his mind. The irony was devastating. What had started as a calculated move to satisfy investors who valued traditional marriage had become the most real thing in his life. But how could he prove that? How could he demonstrate that feelings had changed, that contracts had been superseded by something infinitely more valuable? And more terrifying still, would Sophia see it the same way? Or would she think that his declarations of love had been another strategic move, another way to protect his investment? Would she believe that the past months had been genuine, or would doubt poison everything they had built? He found her in her studio, working on a new piece, a portrait of two figures, their forms intertwined but distinct, painted in shades that bled into each other at the edges. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded immediately when she saw his face. She asked what was wrong, and Alexander realized he was standing at another crossroads. He could try to handle this alone, could attempt to manage the crisis without involving her, protecting her from the complexity and potential consequences. Or he could do what she had asked of him, what they had promised each other. He could be honest, completely and terrifyingly honest, and trust that what they had built was strong enough to withstand the truth. He took a breath and made his choice. He told her everything, about Thornton's call, about the rumors, about the threat hanging over not just his company, but potentially over them, about how the very thing that had brought them together might now tear everything apart, about how he needed to prove their marriage was real, but he didn't know how to do that without making it feel like he was asking her to perform again, to play a role, to be something for the sake of appearances. He told her he would understand if she wanted to walk away, that he wouldn't blame her, that she had signed up for a simple transaction and instead had gotten tangled in complications that weren't fair to her. He told her that he loved her, genuinely and completely, and that was the worst part, because now his love might look like strategy, and he didn't know how to prove it wasn't. Sophia listened to it all, her expression unreadable, her hand still holding the paintbrush dripping ultramarine blue onto the drop cloth. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Alexander felt everything he had feared beginning to manifest. Then she spoke, and what she said wasn't what he expected at all. She set down the paintbrush with deliberate care, wiping her hands on a cloth that was already stained with a dozen different colors, each one marking a moment of creation. Then she looked at him with those eyes that had first struck him as tired, but which he now understood were simply aware, eyes that had seen too much and still chose to look for beauty. She told him that she had been afraid of this from the beginning, not the specific scenario he had just described, but the fundamental vulnerability that comes from caring deeply. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that nothing this good could be simple, that there would be complications and consequences and moments where they would have to choose what they valued most. But here was the thing he needed to understand, she said, her voice steady in a way that made his racing heart begin to slow. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that cafe months ago, desperate and hollow and willing to sell a year of her life for her brother's survival. That woman had believed that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, that vulnerability was dangerous, that the safest way to live was with walls built high and emotions kept carefully contained. But Alexander had changed her, she said, not by trying to change her, but simply by being exactly who he was. By showing her that strength could coexist with tenderness, that success didn't require sacrificing humanity, that it was possible to build something meaningful even when the foundation started with pragmatism rather than passion. He had taught her, without knowing he was teaching, that the bravest thing wasn't protecting yourself from pain, but opening yourself to possibility, despite the risk. So no, she told him, she wasn't going to walk away, not because of contracts or investors or public perception, but because what they had built was real and worth fighting for. If the world wanted proof of their marriage's authenticity, then they would give it the only proof that mattered. They would simply continue being exactly what they had become. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and discovered that love didn't care about contracts or convenience or the rational calculations that govern the business world. Love was its own force, operating by rules that made no logical sense, and yet were more fundamental than any law humans had written. Alexander felt something in his chest expand, filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. He asked her if she was sure, if she understood what she might be risking by staying with him through this crisis. Sophia smiled, and it was that unguarded smile he had first seen the morning after they confessed their feelings, the one that meant she had stopped protecting herself from hope. She told him that risk was just another word for being alive, and she was tired of merely surviving. She was ready to actually live, with all the mess and uncertainty and beauty that entailed. They spent that evening planning, but it felt different from the strategic sessions Alexander was used to. This wasn't about manipulation or perception management, it was about truth. They would face the investors together, not with prepared statements or calculated displays of affection, but with simple honesty. They would explain how their arrangement had begun, acknowledge the unconventional origin, and let their genuine relationship speak for itself. If the investors couldn't see the difference between performance and authenticity, between contract and commitment, then perhaps they weren't the right partners anyway. The meeting happened 2 weeks later in a boardroom that suddenly felt too small, despite its floor-to-ceiling windows and mahogany table that could seat 20. The investor group sat on one side, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious to openly hostile. Alexander and Sophia sat on the other, their hands clasped together above the table where everyone could see. It was Sophia who spoke first, which surprised everyone, including Alexander. She told them the story from the beginning, holding nothing back. She talked about Daniel's illness, about her desperation, about the transaction that had seemed like the only option, available to someone drowning in circumstances beyond her control. She told them about the contract, about the clear boundaries they had set, about how they had both entered the arrangement with eyes wide open and hearts carefully guarded. And then she told them what neither of them had planned for, how sharing space with another human being changes you, how witnessing someone else's struggles and dreams and quiet moments of being human breaks down walls you didn't even know you had built. How you can't schedule when you'll fall in love any more than you can schedule when spring will arrive. You can only notice when it's already happened, and the world has transformed around you. She talked about the small things that had mattered more than grand gestures. How Alexander had learned her coffee order without being told. How he had converted a room into a studio, not because the contract required it, but because he wanted to see her create again. How he sat with her in silence when she couldn't find words, offering presence instead of solutions. How he had never once made her feel small or indebted despite the enormous help he had given her family. She talked about discovering that the person she had married for convenience was actually the person she wanted to spend her life with, and how terrifying and wonderful that realization had been. Alexander watched the investors as Sophia spoke, saw some expressions soften, saw others remain hardened by suspicion or principle. When she finished, James Thornton asked the question that hung in the room like smoke. How could they be certain this wasn't just a more sophisticated performance, a narrative crafted to justify what had been a clear violation of the trust investors had placed in Alexander's representation of his personal life? It was a fair question, Alexander had to admit. How do you prove love? How do you demonstrate that feelings are genuine when feelings themselves are invisible, known only through the actions they inspire and the choices they influence? He had spent his entire career dealing in measurables, profit margins and market share and quantifiable returns on investment. But this was different. This was about convincing a room full of skeptics that something intangible and unmeasurable was nonetheless absolutely real. He thought about everything Sophia had taught him, about vulnerability as a form of courage, about truth as its own kind of power. And he realized that the only proof he could offer was the proof of transformation. He told them about who he had been before Sophia. Ruthlessly focused, emotionally isolated, successful by every external metric and hollow in ways he hadn't even recognized until she gave him a reference point for something different. He told them about the man he was becoming, someone who still worked hard and cared about his company's success, but who now understood that achievement meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. That the point of building something wasn't just to prove you could, but to create value that extended beyond yourself. He told them that the real deception would have been continuing to pretend their marriage was still just a contract when it had evolved into something infinitely more meaningful. That he could have hidden the origin story, could have let them believe it had been conventional from the start. But that would have been a lie of omission. And if his company was going to be built on anything, he wanted it built on truth, even when truth was complicated and uncomfortable. One of the younger investors, a woman named Chen, who had always struck Alexander as more intuitive than the others, asked Sophia a direct question. If Alexander's company failed tomorrow, if all the money disappeared and they were back where they started, would she still want to be married to him? Sophia didn't hesitate. She said yes, without qualification or calculation, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any prepared statement could have. Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Real love existed, independent of circumstances. It persisted when convenience ended. It chose to stay when leaving would be easier. The investors deliberated while Alexander and Sophia waited in an adjacent room, not speaking much, just existing together in the uncertainty. When they were called back in, Thornton delivered the verdict. The investment would continue, not because the board was entirely convinced, he admitted with his characteristic bluntness, but because they had decided that people's lives were messy and complicated and didn't fit neatly into the boxes that contracts and regulations preferred. What mattered was whether Alexander had deliberately deceived them, and the consensus was that he hadn't, or at least that if he had deceived himself as much as anyone else. More importantly, they had seen something in how Sophia and Alexander interacted during the meeting, a synchronicity and mutual respect that felt genuine in a way that performance rarely achieved. They would be watching, Thornton made clear. Not because they doubted, but because trust once questioned required time to fully rebuild. But they were willing to give that time, to bet on the possibility that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings could lead to the most authentic outcomes. Walking out of that building into the late afternoon light, Alexander and Sophia didn't speak immediately. They simply walked, hand in hand, through city streets that felt different now, as if some barrier between them and the world had dissolved. Eventually, they found themselves at the same small park where Alexander used to sit during his darkest days after his father's company collapsed, when he was trying to figure out how to rebuild from nothing. He told her about those days, about the particular quality of loneliness that comes from feeling like you've failed everyone who ever believed in you. Sophia listened, then told him about a concept she had learned in art school, about negative space. The empty areas in a composition that give shape and meaning to what's filled. How you can't appreciate light without darkness, can't understand joy without knowing sorrow, can't recognize love without having felt its absence. She said that maybe their unconventional beginning wasn't a flaw in their story, but the very thing that made their ending possible. That they had both been in their own kinds of negative space, she drowning in crisis, he suffocating in isolation, and maybe that emptiness had given them the shape necessary to fit together. Daniel was released from the hospital 3 weeks later, his treatment successful, his prognosis transformed from grim to hopeful. The first place he wanted to go was to their penthouse, to see his sister in the home she had been describing to him during their hospital visits. Alexander watched Sophia show her brother around, her joy uncomplicated and radiant, and thought about how far they had all traveled from that sterile courthouse where they had shaken hands like business partners. Daniel pulled Alexander aside at one point, his hand firm despite his still recovering strength. He thanked him, not just for the money or the treatment, but for seeing his sister as she truly was, for recognizing her strength and beauty and worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. He told Alexander that he had been worried those first months, that his sister was sacrificing too much, trading herself away piece by piece to save him. But now he could see that she hadn't been diminished by the arrangement. She had been transformed by it, had found something she didn't even know she was missing. Daniel said he hoped Alexander understood what a gift that was, to help someone discover parts of themselves they had lost or never knew existed. That night, after Daniel had left for the apartment they had rented nearby for his recovery, Alexander and Sophia stood on their balcony under a sky unusually clear for the city, stars visible like punctuation marks in a story still being written. She asked him if he regretted how things had started, if he wished they had met differently, conventionally, without all the complexity and contract and crisis. Alexander thought about the question seriously before answering. He told her that he used to believe life was something you controlled through careful planning and risk mitigation, that the goal was to eliminate uncertainty and create predictable outcomes. But she had taught him something different, that the best things in life almost never happen according to plan, that trying to control everything meant missing out on the unexpected gifts that come from letting go of control. If they had met at a party or through friends, would they have noticed each other? Would he have seen past his own ambition long enough to recognize what she offered? Would she have trusted him without the forced proximity that made avoidance impossible? He didn't think so. Their arrangement, strange as it was, had created the conditions for something rare to grow. It had forced them to exist in each other's orbit long enough for gravitational pull to take effect. Sophia leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and said that she had learned something too, that she had spent so long being afraid of loss, of vulnerability, of asking for help, that she had almost missed the one thing that makes all that fear worthwhile. That loving someone, really loving them, means accepting that you might lose them, that you will disappoint them sometimes, that they will see you at your worst, and might choose to leave. It means taking the leap anyway, trusting that the beauty of connection outweighs the pain of potential loss. She said that their story had taught her that love isn't diminished by unconventional origins or complicated circumstances. If anything, maybe it's strengthened by them. Maybe the relationships that have to fight to exist are the ones that understand their own value most clearly. They made one final amendment to their contract that week. They met with Alexander's lawyer and formally dissolved the original marriage agreement, replacing it with nothing except mutual choice. There would be no terms or end dates, no financial arrangements or performance requirements. Just two people choosing each other freely every single day for as long as that choice felt right. The lawyer seemed confused by the request. Why officially dissolve an agreement that had already been superseded by their actual marriage? But Alexander insisted. Symbols mattered. Rituals of transformation mattered. He wanted there to be a clear moment when they could say that what came before was finished and what came next was entirely voluntary. They renewed their vows 6 months later, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This time there was no courthouse, no quick ceremony squeezed between business obligations. They stood in a small gallery where Sophia's paintings were being exhibited for the first time, surrounded by friends and family and the visual evidence of her journey from darkness into color. Daniel stood as Alexander's best man, healthy and whole, living proof that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when you refuse to stop fighting. When the officiant asked if they took each other, not for business or convenience or any external reason, but simply because they chose this person above all others, their responses carried the weight of everything they had learned about how you can't plan when or how love will arrive, about how the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that keep us from what we most need, about how transformation doesn't happen in grand dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small choices to show up, to be honest, to stay when leaving would be easier. about how the best relationships aren't the ones that start perfectly, but the ones that become perfect through the daily work of choosing each other again and again. As they kissed, sealing vows that felt infinitely more binding than any contract could ever be, Alexander thought about the question that had started everything. Was it possible to fall in love with someone you never intended to care for at all? The answer, he now understood, wasn't just yes. It was that sometimes those were exactly the relationships that mattered most. Because they forced you to question your assumptions about what love should look like, about how connection should form, about which parts of your carefully constructed life were protecting you, and which were just keeping you alone. Years later, when people asked them how they met, they told the truth. Not because it was romantic in the conventional sense, but because it was real. They had married for business and found something infinitely more valuable, partnership built not on illusion but on seeing each other completely, flaws and fears and all, and choosing to stay anyway. Their story became something they shared with Daniel's children when explaining that love comes in many forms, that there's no single right way for hearts to find each other, that sometimes what looks like a transaction is actually fate wearing a disguise. That the measure of a relationship isn't how it starts, but what it becomes when both people commit to growth and honesty and showing up even when it's hard. On quiet mornings, Alexander still woke before Sophia and watched her sleep, and he still thought about contracts and risk and calculated decisions. But now he understood something he hadn't known in that rain-soaked office where he first signed papers meant to secure his company's future. The greatest risk isn't in caring too much or letting someone past your defenses. The greatest risk is in never taking the risk at all, in letting fear of loss prevent you from experiencing connection in the first place. Because love, real love, isn't about guarantees or safety or predictable outcomes. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be brave, who sees your darkness and stays anyway, who transforms your carefully managed life into something messier and more complicated and infinitely more beautiful than anything you could have planned. Was it possible to fall in love with someone you never intended to care for at all? Perhaps the better question was this: could you meet someone in the most calculated circumstances imaginable and discover that the human heart recognizes no contracts, respects no boundaries, and operates by a logic that makes no sense except in retrospect? When you look back and realize that everything that seemed like chance was actually leading you exactly where you needed to be. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not how two people fell in love despite their arrangement, but how we ever convince ourselves that love can be controlled in the first place.